So I'm going to preface this by saying, as a good feminist, I normally do conference papers that kind of go from critique to utopia. I'm afraid I'm just doing critique today. I got stuck somewhere on the road to utopia, but perhaps between us we'll make it there. Because I've gone back into, I've concentrated, as it turned out with the wealth of material, I ended up concentrating very much on the interrelation of paratext and text in the 1990s through sort of Sigourney Weaver's involvement then. And I can see ways of extrapolating it forward, but I do actually think there's a number of tensions and issues for feminism, looking at her kind of role within that first Alien series that are worth discussing even now. So I do read papers. I'm far too nervous to do anything else, but I try and sort of break it up a bit as I go along as well. So my paper is designed as a feminist publication regarding the authorship of the Alien franchise in relation to Ripley, character Ripley, and Sigourney Weaver's labour in creating that iconic role. My argument relies on the disparate directorial credits for the series, which, according to the orthodoxies of academic and popular film writing, undermines a claim to consistent curation of the Alien vision through the auteur-director. So I'm just trying to disturb that orthodoxy. How far can Weaver, who is the only one of the cast and crew to have been part of every film of the series, achieving a co-producer credit from Alien 3 onwards, be considered an author of the franchise? She's persistently the face of the franchise alongside the alien itself, the xenomorph, in an echo of the relationship of the monster to its mother. In the brief time allowed here, I want to explore how far the parallels between Ripley and Weaver extend and emerge through considering the paratextual material, such as interviews and DVD extras, that can support a feminist argument regarding her agency. Overall, what is the potential through that intersection and interaction for her labour within the films to make an argument about the extent of her agency in the paratext? And I'm saying that's limited, that's constrained because of the alienated state of women's labour in the film industry in general. Weaver occupies a central position at film releases and in the celebration of the franchises at all its various anniversaries. Since, as a result of the success of Alien, which was her first film, she has become a bankable star. Weaver emerged out of a theatre background and had to be directed by Ridley Scott not to look in the camera, or by one anecdote, repeated more than once in the paratextual materials, to be berated by him about motivation and teacups in a mode of displacing actually his anger towards John Hurt and his kind of taking up of kind of directorial time. However, despite these challenges, her interpretation of Ripley won her an Oscar nomination for Aliens in the year that Marley Matlin won for Children of a Lesser God, with Kathleen Turner, Sissy Spacek and Jane Fonda as fellow nominees. Weaver therefore arguably lifted the B genre into more elite realms alongside often first-time or second-time directors. I am being deliberately very provocative about the directors. There is this movement, for example, from the ensemble pictures, kind of like iconic of this, from the first film to the image which foregrounds Weaver in Alien 3. In the published volume, Alien the Archive, the ultimate guide to the classic movies, it is Weaver who gives the introduction, and that's actually where the previous, I can put that back for you. Yeah, the original, that's what hits you, the xenomorph, and then Sigourney. Alien the Archive, the ultimate guide to the classic movies, it's Weaver who is given the introduction with the image of her development over the quadrilogy at the top of the piece that she had written. Firstly to note, this is a feminist reading of Weaver who does not take up a feminist position publicly. There is a conflicted performance in these paratexts by Weaver in relation to gender. She is, after all, the actor who suggested that James Cameron only failed to win at the 2009 Oscars because he didn't have breasts. This being the year that Catherine Bigelow briefly broke through the glass ceiling and won for the first time as a female director. Despite the wealth of academic literature, so my analysis crosses over text and paratext to explore some of the tensions that arise regarding Weaver and her gender. Paratextual study has grown because of its unique position at the intersection of text and context, aptly described Gerald Jeanette as a threshold space, which is itself fluid without rigorous limits, either moving towards the interior of the text or towards the exterior, the discourse of the world on the text. The paratext therefore acts as an entry and exit point for interpretation and reinterpretation for audiences in relation to films. It is also recognised by film scholars as a performative space, allowing directors to, in German director Alexander Kluger's words, strategically embrace identities in paratext and tell many stories as part of the commercial agency, which also nevertheless culturally and socially monitors spectatorial identification and critical reception. And that's Timothy Corrigan's kind of analysis of Kluger's words. Thus, returning to Jeanette, the paratext is a zone not of transition but of transaction. My focus on the materials created retrospectively by the participants on the release of the third and the fourth film and the quadrilogy box set are for the original Alien series. Alongside the DVD extras, which I've rewatched, God, that was hard work, it was just brilliant. Alongside the more traditional published film interviews, are more significant in relation to what Corrigan has termed the drama of the movie's source, which may be told to its audiences. The Alien series, unlike more conventional films, demonstrates a fan base and a loyal audience that can be relied upon to consume the DVD extras as cinephiles and alien obsessives. That's a compliment. They are engaged with a specific sense, in Barbara Klinger's words, of owning a personalised product, or, as Catherine Grant has described, drawing from the director's commentary, hermeneutic understanding, transacting, the director being able to transact meaning in relation to the text. What might be achieved then by such a powerful star performer? In examining this provocation, or in sort of staging this provocation, I sort of suggest that Weaver should be considered the primary author of the series, but then a gendered disassociation emerges. Weaver both demonstrates her own agency and is subject to being written over by others, especially to be expected in a genre such as horror and science fiction. In the exchange that takes place between her image, her labour, and capital within the film industry, I want to demonstrate that this is related to the overall alienated conditions of labour for women inside of that institution. Right, and then I've sort of put up quotes, I won't necessarily read them all out. But the casting of a woman in the role was according to the mythology, so this telling of this story in paratext that's taken place years after the films were made. It was already an idea in place, according to Ridley Scott, when he was hired as director. David Giler commented that, having seen the success of films such as Julia and The Turning Point, you don't know The Turning Point, it's a ballet film, there was a desire to kind of somehow manoeuvre this horror film into a position more sympathetic for female audiences and therefore greater commercial appeal. And that's Weaver's recalling her screen test, stating, indicating how important it was in her being hired that the secretarial staff at Pinewood took to her immediately. Despite the importance of her gender, what occurs by analysing the text and the paratext together, sorry, because I've skipped a bit and brought it in earlier, so this is my fault. By analysing the text and the paratext together, we get to see this tension between the fact that Weaver constantly disassociates herself from gender and from gendered readings of her position as Ripley within the films, and she refuses the term feminist itself, representing the kind of strength as typically emotional labour adopted by women, utilising language such as capable, which is seen in one quote here, how women have to protect their homes and children, somehow subliminally seem to make a parallel between horror and sci-fi with the kind of Western film myths and women as homesteaders who should be seen as guarding over the domestic space. In fact, Weaver frequently disassociates herself from her own physical strength in drawing attention to the bodily labour affected in playing the role. Repeated anecdotes, and again I've got an example here that was published in Premier magazine in a sort of diary format, so this is Weaver talking, return to her physical weakness and her emotional sensitivity around her performances. A pre-shoot training on Alien Resurrection demonstrates her fear in relation to the swimming scene underneath during the shoot, saying that she arrived from 4 months revelling in New York in playing a blonde nympho wrapped in a sheet on Broadway and only appearing late at the pre-shoot training. Fearful of the underwater sequence, telling the crew that she would not be able to film it at all, ever, Weaver recounts having to turn to her husband, theatre director Jim Simpson, who advises her to act the scene as Ripley, channeling her reserves of power rather than channeling the character's reserves of power rather than relying on herself, because she's simply so overwhelmed by her own physical fear. This trope, in terms of her positioning of herself within paratext, is repeated again through other actors' anecdotes about her greater sensitivity, how she cried between takes because of the lacerations on her wrist from the handcuffs that are put on the hybrid creature she's now playing in Alien Resurrection, and also following the slap that Veronica Cartwright administered to her as Lambert in the first Alien film. The macho gun culture of Aliens was of the antithesis of Weaver's sensibilities, although this was unshared by Gail Ann Hurd, for example, on set, and by James Cameron. So, as a film star, she disassociates. She has these constant narratives circulating around her height and about her appearance, but she constantly disassociates herself, A, from a kind of feminist discourse, and B, from a discourse of actual physical and bodily power in terms of her performance as Ripley accrues to being part alien. In order to understand this negotiation that's going on further, I've taken some time to look in more detail at her actual labour in certain film sequences in constructing that character. And I'm looking at her kinds of non-performances of emotion throughout the series. Winona Ryder talks in DVD Extras about the fact that Weaver turned up with notebooks on the character of Ripley, several notebooks on Alien Resurrection, to which she referred all the time, which indicate the attention to detail and that her labour is therefore precise and conscious. I want to introduce an idea which I think is really appropriate for her playing and her labour in playing Ripley from Jackie Stacey's work, actually, on an actor called Tilda Swinton, you might be familiar with, which is the idea of the importance of flat effect or effectless deadpan in her acting style. Stacey's contention is that Swinton's performances contradict the conventional expectations of feminine emotional expressiveness and legibility in popular cinema. Melanie Bell has taken on this idea further and used Stacey's approach, rather sort of indicating out how it is malleable and can be applied, by using it to analyse Julie Christie in Don't Look Now. And she argues that Christie moves from expressing a kind of normative femininity in this film to a kind of blankness. The key thing is that both Stacey and Bell contend how these actors' performances set up conversations with what they call histories of femininity, in their contradictory modes between normative femininity and blankness, and the way that they, in the end, refuse audience attempts to potentially empathise with the character. And for Bell in particular, the use of flat effect by Christie, or elsewhere irony in her performances, moves her into a proto-feminist or a feminist position. Specifically in regard to Sigourney Weaver, I think there's a further issue in her own refutation of feminist intent, which kind of creates a conflicted account of her femininity in playing Ripley, and therefore makes her flatness open to kind of feminist interpretation. Applying the notion of flat effect, specifically in a female performance in the genre of science fiction, might explain why her character has retained interest from a typical science fiction community or fan base. And one such example of this is the sort of admiring magazine commentary that called her SF's hardest femme, which has quite a number of kind of unresolved overtones in terms of lesbianism, but certainly suggests that the genre of science fiction journalism is attempting to resolve that disturbance of femininity in the performance. Right, so I'm just going to run these sequences of really her acting from Alien through Alien 3. We can perhaps discuss, if you want to do, why I've ignored Aliens, but I've ignored Aliens through to the final film. It is clear that Weaver's use of flat effect changes through the course of the films. In Alien, a close reading of her facial responses and her voice demonstrates a movement between feminine emotionality and masculine logic. There is emotion there in her face that she's controlling. In the sequence post-Alice's death, Ripley takes charge. Weaver's vocal performance, which I'm not playing for you here, accentuates the barely disguised tremors indicating her emotion, whilst the blank rigidity of her face connotes her wish to stay in control. Lambert, as played by Veronica Cartwright, sets up a parallel visual of female and vocal female hysteria, which makes Weaver's Ripley appear more masculine in her relative control. And it's kind of phrases as well as like I'm thinking that kind of anchor that. However, I would argue that Weaver's performance does reflect, as told to Ian Home, a woman surviving in a hostile environment and finding the means to do so only moment to moment. The performance of flat effect is readable to a female audience as one that is adopted as the negotiation necessary within the constraints of their position, a carefully controlled mask over fear, despair and rage. Weaver's performance as she listens for Dallas or later confronts Ash indicates, however, what I would, using the non-verbal communication term of leakage, of the paralingual indications of stress covered over very quickly by attempts to control it. There is every possibility that the flat effect adopted by Weaver enables a screen surrogate to be sustained for the typical science fiction male viewer. And that's kind of to move on to Alien Resolution. I might come back to that. I just want to talk about this. This is except for a repeated trope in Alien and Alien 3, where the threat of sexual violence occurs to indicate the limits of Ripley's strength or rebellion. As indicated in these screen grabs, her facial performance shows a breaking down of effective deadpan, as termed by Jackie Stacey, in the revelation of fear and subsequently rage. I'm provocatively going to say that I see this trope as a disturbing reassurance of the limits of this character narratively within the genre. In Alien 3, faced with the atavistic male society, her performance is indicative of embattled resistance as against physical vulnerability. So I think that's just there, as if you don't know the films. But it was just to put a visual up with this as well. Weaver's effective deadpan in Alien Resurrection expresses clearly her accretion to an alien separateness by this stage in the quadrilogy. However, and I think that this is really visible in this scene with Winona Ryder. It is one through which she is able to express great tenderness, particularly in relation to Paul, the non-human who is too humane to be human. These subtleties of her effect in her performance indicate a different kind of gendered narrative through the series, in which the alienated Ripley, driven by violence and betrayal, looks in fact towards her home as a stranger, returning there more comfortable, more at ease in the company of similar outsiders. Charles Hicks, in talking about motherhood in the Alien series, has argued recently that it's much less these questions about monstrous motherhood and the binary oppositions that have followed the series in terms of theoretical understanding, and it is in fact a more complicated realisation of Ripley's own subjectivity working within a network of phallogocentric representation. Motherhood has moved, I would argue, on the back of that. Motherhood is the trope by which Ripley moves outside of patriarchal control, moves outside of the company when she sacrifices herself and her child into the molten lead. And I think in paratext, there is a parallel going on. Weaver's direct and personal contribution to this aspect of the films. Weaver's direct and personal contribution to this aspect of the films, and it's here where she's talking about her own struggles with motherhood and the way in which she talked with the writers about incorporating this narrative idea. However, and then the previous things about Stalin, but it's just too much to get in. However, the problem in Grey, had I been the only woman director to win in 50 years, I would have come out naked. So in the published paratextual material, whilst it is Weaver's face and body which dominate the publicity material, she is constantly in negotiation with the space that she's existing in. I would say even Mark Kermode's commentary on the featurette for Alien determines how the film franchise was notable for allowing innovation in authorship simply from the male rising stars as director. Therefore, Weaver's ownership is tenuous, negotiated, and is subject to her own denials of control. As in Starburst magazine, when she laughs at their comment, which was here, about how she has swindled her co-producer credit on the Alien 3 films. And it's that kind of female laughter that's kind of reassuring, but it's also part of that discomfort, similar to kind of Ripley's flat effect in the films. By contrast, sorry, too much technology. By contrast, an unnamed special effects designer at Pinewood blames Weaver for the delays and uncertainties that beset that film. Within those films, Ripley is able to claim herself the monster's mother, but outside of the films, in paratext, Weaver is far more constrained. The tensions I've described above between Weaver in paratext and Ripley in screen create a dissonance which leave the histories of femininity unresolved in favour of a celebration of the archetypal masculinised values of science fiction. Moreover, in leaving these tensions unresolved and that question of motherhood, in this case of the project itself, leaving that unclaimed means that the language is open to reconfiguration outside of her control. So in last November's Empire Classics, the headline indicated that Ridley Scott, in fact, birthed the Alien series, co-opting the right of motherhood, which has been so central to the series thematically, to a male auteur rather than the female star, rather than the female performer. The last line of the series, for me, so far provides a fitting metaphor for Weaver's position. Her control disavowed, and therefore, as I proposed at the beginning of my paper, a purveyor of alienated labour within a machine of which she has little control of. And that is why, ever since I've seen the series, that I wanted to go back and work out why that sentence had resonated with me so strongly. I think I can say now it is because she remains a stranger here in the contradictory tensions between text and paratext.
A 1985 cartoon strip, Dykes to Watch Out For, illustrates a scene called The Rule. In it, two women struggle to find a film to watch as one of them laments how few films meet the requirements of her rules, that she will only watch a film with at least two women in it who talk to each other about something other than a man. The partner remarks, "It's pretty strict, but a good idea," to which the other replies, "No kidding, the last movie I was able to see was Alien. The two women in it talk to each other about the monster." The punchline gently mocks the low-grade horror which inspires Ridley Scott's 1979 film, whilst making a serious point about the lack of diverse female representation on screen. Yet 40 years after the release of Alien, it seems particularly apt that the cartoon created by Alison Bechdel and Liz Wallace, which has since become widely known as the Wallace-Bechdel or Bechdel test, a concept which is used as a feminist litmus test for popular cinema, should choose this film as its key example. However jokingly the reference to Alien was originally intended to be, the link between film, female characterisation, female audience members, and most importantly feminism, now seems prophetic. Ripley has since become an important feminist figure in cultural commentaries and fan communities, praised for what The Independent's Sadiq Kasuss calls the film's trailblazing feminism. As prevalent as such comments are within popular discourses, the feminist credentials of Alien and its franchise are extensively debated within scholarly literature, with some theorists raising serious doubts about the supposed progressive nature of Ripley's character. The aim of this paper is to outline some of these debates first, and then suggest that the disparity of opinions surrounding Alien and feminism can be contextualised in a different way, namely through the traditions of the female Gothic. Reading the film as a Gothic in space offers another way to historically situate the film, emphasise the significance of female representation, and illuminate the positive, ambivalent, contradictory, and ultimately compelling readings which continue to haunt discussions about Ripley and feminism. So, to start, some background information then on how feminism has been evoked in relation to Alien. Within present day or recent critical reviews, the analysis of Alien is often focused upon Ripley, the representation of who is interpreted as emblematic of the progressive, strong and independent woman born out of the political and societal battles fought for by radical and second-wave feminist movements of the late 1960s and 70s. Kate Erland describes Ripley as a boundary-busting heroine and continues, "A female badass like Ripley was something new, something bold, and Weaver and Scott made good on the promise of such a character, and she's still one of the most memorable and enduring heroines ever." Ed Kamm notes how within film history, Ripley's significance to feminism is in the way the film is anchored in the central lesson that competent women will save the day. Culturally, Ripley's importance extends to present-day feminist movements, as Kamm concludes. Ripley's intelligence and resolve against the biggest threats in a world full of aggressive, violent men remain a benchmark in an era of Me Too. Sam Brooks, The Guardian, took the opportunity of the 30th year anniversary of the film, so 10 years ago, to celebrate Ripley's legacy, calling her the first action heroine, writing, "And yet ultimately in the film it all comes back to Ripley. In the figure of the cultish, resolute Sigourney Weaver, Alien may just be the film that overhauled the old, unreconstructed horror genre and dared to put a woman centre stage." Similarly, Winona Ryder, who, as we heard, has co-starred in Weaver in 1997's Alien Resurrection, reflects upon Ripley's legacy by saying, "I remember the impact Alien had on me. I had never seen a female character like that. It was the first female action hero that I had and that any of us had." These relatively recent reviews and commentaries on the film, so most taken from within the last decade or so, all identify Ripley as a progressive turning point in cinematic female representation. Scholarly analysis of the film are somewhat more ambivalent. George Moore characterises Ripley as a figure who actually incorporates both feminist ideas and reactions against feminism. And as he continues, "In the end, it is Ripley's relationship to the emerging conflicts centred around radical feminism that best suits her role in Alien, and which best provides a means of exploring the contradictions found in her image as both the product of male discourse, in writers, directors and producers, as Francis Broad, and society's desire to find in her an image of the liberated woman. Moore's conclusion urges caution in reading Ripley as unambiguously feminist. Rather, her character is contradictory, not least of all because she is still the invention of male discourse, a point highlighted in the often quoted story that Ripley was not originally written as a female character, as we've heard. The implication here being that any identifiable feminism within the film was therefore entirely accidental. Harvey Greenberg finds an otherwise elegant film ideologically problematic, calling Alien's claims to feminism doubtful and an exercise in wishful thinking. Elizabeth Hills provides an overview of other similar negative interpretations, observing how much of this stems, somewhat ironically perhaps, from feminist writers. For example, Judith Newton argues the film is at once wish-fulfilling or utopian and protectively repressive in its thrust. Ross Jennings pursues a similar argument, concluding, although Ridley Scott chose to make Ripley the hero of the film, he chose to inscribe her in such a way as to neutralise the significance of her threat in ascending to the male domain of movie hero. As Hill notes, these arguments reflect a line of thinking which does not move beyond a binary and rather gender-essentialist logic. Newton Jennings implied that strong female characters cannot both be vulnerable and brave, feminine and masculine. The resistance towards viewing Alien as feminist is further evident by the common interpretation of conceptualising Ripley as a final girl. The term coined by Carol Clover articulates a trend in slasher horror from the 1970s in which a strong female character will eventually defeat the villain or killer, seen in Black Christmas and Halloween. Although such a figure embodies much transgressive potential, encouraging audience engagement with a woman who uses violence to survive, Clover conceptualises the final girl as a masculinised figure, functioning as a male substitute, an observation which echoes Newton's and Jennings' reading of Ripley. Indeed, Clover herself expresses her scepticism of the final girl's feminist potential and uses the Alien franchise to support her point. She writes, "Figuratively seen, the final girl is a male substitute. To applaud the final girl as a feminist development, as some reviewers of Aliens have done with Ripley, is, in light of her figurative meaning, a particularly grotesque expression of wishful thinking." Scholars then have cast doubt upon Ripley's feminist status, with some going as far as to deny this altogether. So, as you may have noticed, three of the writers quoted here have called such a connection wishful thinking. This stands in stark contrast to the celebratory analysis of the film offered by critics and reviews, as highlighted earlier. Leaving for now the disjuncture that often happens between academic theory and popular culture, why does such a difference exist, and is there a way to bring these differing opinions into dialogue? As Ricky Schubert has noted, the female hero is defined by an in-betweenness, which in the case of the Alien franchise is marked by possibility and potential. The debate over whether Ripley is a feminist figure may not be easily resolved, but her character opens up the potential for subversion by calling attention to existing gender roles. In the final part of this paper, I would like to draw attention to another possibility and potential by contextualising the film within the tradition of the female Gothic, a genre which helps to further articulate the debate surrounding the interpretation of Ripley within a feminist context. Okay. So, it is interesting to note that while academic and recent cultural commentaries often focus upon the gender representation and feminism within the film, such topics did not evidently feature as a dominant discourse from contemporaneous reviews at the time. So, unfortunately, I won't be able to kind of fully explore these here now, but by way of example, Derek Malcolm, in 1979 from The Guardian, focused his review on the film's basic plot and special effects, the latter of which was praised in Variety's original review, which also comments on the lack of character involvement. A more damning indictment comes from Pauline Kamm, who uses Alien as proof that audiences in 79 apparently are jaded and only interested in, quote, noisy thrills and dumb jokes and images that move along in an undemanding way, end quote. Ouch. Vincent Canby's 79 review in the New York Times does, however, offer an observation which can be brought to bear on this discussion of gender. Canby calls Alien a Gothic set in space, noting there is something old-fashioned about the film. There was once a time when this sort of thing was set in an old dark house, on a moor, in a thunderstorm. Being trendy, Mr. Scott and his associates have sent it up in space. Kamm here is calling Alien Gothic. He's not the only writer to do so. More recently, Roger Luckhurst has called the film An Old Dark House in Space, while Fred Botton observes that the film's aesthetics are painted in, quote, recognisably dark Gothic colours, and the mise-en-scène sketches a familiar Gothic landscape and architecture, end quote. More specifically, the film can be identified, I argue, within the female Gothic. The female Gothic is a term coined by Ellen Moores in 1976 to identify a specific trend in literature which focuses on the work that women writers have done in the literary mode that since the 18th century we have called the Gothic. Anne Radcliffe is a key example whose work illuminates the centrality of the female protagonist to these stories. This character, whom Moores describes as a young woman who is simultaneously persecuted victim and courageous heroine, is, as Helen Hansen describes, a figure involved in navigating adventure and change in the course of the Gothic narrative. Her interpretation bestows the agency of an adventure on the Gothic heroine, an explorer who encounters danger and threat as concomitant with her narrative positioning. Hansen is one of many scholars who have traced the historical development of this archetype, and she argues that the female Gothic heroine enters into film history in the 1940s Hollywood Gothic films, which include, amongst others, Rebecca from 1940, The Spiral Staircase from 46, and Secret Beyond the Door from 47. Such films place an emphasis on the central heroine, who is imperiled in some way within a threatening environment, usually the aforementioned old dark house, and this female protagonist must navigate this space, whilst often fighting for her life, in order to face and dispel hidden secrets and terrors. The female Gothic heroine is a transgressive figure. In literary and filmic examples, she has narrative agency, her perception of events are privileged, and her investigation invariably challenges oppressive patriarchal forces which seek to control and remove her political, societal, and even bodily autonomy. The Gothic heroine has continued to feature on our cinema screens in various forms, and there is a close relationship here between Horror's The Final Girl and the Gothic heroine, which I won't have time to kind of discuss in this paper. But Ripley can be classified, I would say, as a Gothic heroine. As already highlighted, the film activates its relationship to the Gothic within its mise-en-scène. Joanna Russ notes that in female Gothic narratives, the old dark house is always named, and one of the film's opening shots provides us with that precise information. The vessel floating in the gloom of space is the Nostromo. Another shot from beneath the ship further emphasised its suitably convoluted design, a trait of Gothic excess, and an edit to the interior of the ship reveals a corridor, and then the mobile camera roams around the space, turning to reveal another corridor, longer and darker than the first. It is significant that these images should form the basis of our introduction to the interior of the ship. Corridors are liminal spaces, the connective tissue of buildings bridging the delicate divide between the public and the private, outside and inside. These are boundaries which will later be explicitly breached by the Xenomorph's attack, and it is within these corridors that we will later view Ripley, as the sole survivor, navigate the last vestiges of a home made inhospitable. Like other female Gothic stories, the security and safety of the domestic is violently disrupted by terror and threat, dramatising and literalising the conflict Freud finds in the etymology of the word unheimlich, or uncanny, the homely made strange. The female Gothic is defined by its emphasis upon the experiences of the female protagonist, and it could be argued that this key ingredient is missing for a substantial part of this film. After these initial shots, it takes approximately 5 minutes of screen time to even see the human inhabitants, and Ripley's lone fight against the alien only begins after the deaths of Lambert and Parker at around the hour-and-a-half mark. However, there are signs throughout the narrative which single Ripley out and point towards her eventual centrality in a manner evocative of female Gothic conventions. Early on, Ripley is highlighted as an independent and resourceful crew member. Unlike others who are associated with specific colleagues like Breton Parker, Ripley appears like an outsider, loyal to her own set of principles and professionalism. The early exchange, through which Ripley discovers the presumed SOS transmission, is a warning, is depicted through tight framing. The concern about her face is juxtaposed with the suspicious behaviour on Ash. the beginning of a strained relationship, which leads Ripley to soon acknowledge that she doesn't trust him, a revelation that arouses viewer suspicion too. It's also notable that Ripley, as a woman in jeopardy, is also hinted at early on. Upon discovering the face hugger missing from Kane, Ripley, Dallas and Ash search for it in the infirmary, and the creature unexpectedly falls on Ripley from above. Her frightful reaction ends the tense suspense of the scene in an encounter which remains unique to her, as this marks the first attack, albeit a false one, from the alien on board the ship, and of course she survives. The film's cinematography subtly changes over the course of the film to mirror the narrative's eventual focus on her. When Ash is examining the facehugger, seemingly alone in the lab, a moving camera approaches, searching for space. Moments later, Ripley enters the shot, so in that middle image, she's just on screen left, revealing her presence and thereby aligning this previous movement with her own, and then she kind of cuts across the screen and it's on the right there, you can just about see. Similarly, during Dallas's fatal exploration of the air ducts, Ripley is framed in a repeated close-up, and she is placed in the foreground when taking command of the ship as a result of his death. In these instances, Ripley is given agency both narratively and visually, the editing and shot types giving her what Karen Hollinger has elsewhere called, quote, an overwhelming visual presence, end quote. And I'm just going to play you a little bit of an extract just to kind of demonstrate this a bit later in the film. So, shots of the corridors are used again near the end of the film, as seen here. This time the mobile framing is anchored to Ripley, with the camera tracking her movement, mimicking her frantic running, and even revealing some point-of-view shots. In this scene in particular, the Gothicness of the space, evident from the film's opening shots, is recoded with specific female Gothic iconography. Where the Radcliffean Gothic heroine would stereotypically explore the labyrinth of corridors in the old dark house in the middle of the night with a candelabra, here Ripley does the same, but this time in space with a flamethrower. There we go. Okay. The film's visuals and narrative thus hint towards Ripley's eventual dominance in a story which is finally revealed to be a woman in peril scenario. And like other female Gothics, this development is carefully crafted to emphasise her perception and limit the viewer's knowledge and experience of events to that of female protagonists. It is this narrative and spectator alignment which is at the heart of what Hanson calls the female Gothic's political charge. As Diane Waldman notes in her analysis of the Hollywood Gothic films, the basis of the female Gothic narrative is built upon ambiguity, the hesitation between two possible interpretations of events. The Gothic heroine's perception is tested. In such narratives, the heroine's interpretation of events often faces constant doubt and invalidation from other characters. Alien situates this patterning and narrative tension of observation and interpretation versus denial and dismissal with Ripley, who actively investigates the causes behind the life-threatening events taking place, asking questions and demanding answers. By comparison, Brett and Parker are characterised by their main motivation to gain an increased percentage, and Dallas increasingly ignores protocol and due process after the attack on Kamm. Ripley, however, discovers the transmission to be a warning, orders that the contaminated Kamm not be allowed back on the ship, observes that in doing so Ash has endangered everyone else, she expresses her suspicion of Ash, and she uncovers the company's real objectives. These revelations mark poignant points in the plot's progression and are enabled by Ripley's actions. Equally important for female Gothic reading is the fact that her observations are continually undermined by others. Brett and Parker attempt to pressure her into agreeing to their demands early in the film, and the latter is initially hostile to Ripley's eventual leadership. As already mentioned, Ash attempts to downplay her discovery with the transmission, and then overrides her order to deny Kane entry onto the ship. Similarly, Dallas dismisses her suspicions and recommendations concerning Ash. The threat against Ripley is, then, as a direct result of the other characters' attempts to deny her perception of events. extending on Ed Cummings' earlier observation that the film's central lesson is that competent women will save the day, we can add that women will save the day despite the best efforts of men to the contrary. Walden notes that the resolution of the Gothic's narrative ambiguity, the revelation, the danger observed by the heroine is either true or false, carries with it ideological implications. Either the heroine's safety is purchased at the expense of her perception, she was wrong to be frightened, or she is correct in her judgments and the real danger is revealed. It is for this reason that Bottom observes that women's Gothic, it seems, straddles contradiction and challenge, persecution and pleasure. Similarly, David Hunter and Glenys Byron write that whether female Gothic should be seen as radical or conservative has been an issue of particular concern. It is here that I propose we can better understand the disparities outlined earlier and the eventual difficulty in assessing the film's feminism. The female Gothic is at its core both radical and conservative, to borrow Hunter and Byron's terms. These stories are powerful for the way they focus upon women's experiences, offering critiques of the patriarchal structures which seek to deny such experiences and agency. However, such a critique remains for Waldman only a potential. She observes that sexist social structures are rarely entirely disrupted or removed by the end of the story. Similarly, Maria Tartar notes that the Gothic heroine's investigative agency is ultimately limited. The ending of the story will conclude the heroine's transgressive actions, returning her, as in the Radcliffean tradition, back to female domesticity and entrapment. This is what Lisa Peirce has called elsewhere in her investigation of on-screen heroines a containment strategy. And it is interesting that this arguably eventually proves to be Ripley's fate. Aliens, the sequel, will literally return Ripley home, and then her future adventures are conducted within the context of motherhood. And I've discussed the relationship between female Gothic and aliens elsewhere, but I'm not going to go into that. To conclude then, the female Gothic holds in tension these contradictions, and the relationship between this tradition and Alien is further underlined by historically contextualising the film. Moore's seminal work on the topic was published just 3 years before Alien was released in '79, and in that same year, Angela Carter released her feminist reworkings of the female Gothic's archetypal origin text in The Bloody Chamber. Alien is therefore contemporaneous to works in fiction and scholarly debate, which revived and defined the female Gothic tradition in the 1970s onwards, igniting the debates around feminism which, as I've noted here today, continue to remain relevant. You will note that I have not attempted to say definitively whether Alien is indeed feminist or not within this specific theoretical framing. Reading Alien in female Gothic terms invariably denies such an easy conclusion. But I will say that the film should be celebrated, as it is here at such an event, for bringing to the fore questions of female representation with a dynamic dialectic that is now entering its 4th decade. It is for those reasons that, when given the choice, I, like Bechdel and Wallace, will also always elect